Hi, everyone. It's Rob, and thanks for listening in today. I greatly appreciate your time. Today, I chat with Jennifer Erickson, a Schmidt Futures Innovation Fellow focused on applying data driven solutions to the organ donation shortage. She served in the Obama White House as the Assistant Director of Innovation for Growth in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, where her work focused on inclusive entrepreneurship and grand challenges, such as ending the organ waiting list. Previously, Jennifer worked at the Center for American Progress at Bain & Company and served as a special advisor to the First Minister of Scotland. You'll learn about leadership and why organ collection is a serious issue in America. As an organ donor myself, I had no idea. Imagine this. We spend $36 billion per year on kidney failure, 1% of the federal budget. If organ collection improved, it would greatly reduce this cost. But most importantly, it would greatly improve the life of the person receiving a kidney. Okay, so please enjoy this mind-opening chat with Jennifer Erickson. Jennifer, thanks for joining me today. I'm so glad to see you.
You too. Thanks for having me.
We were talking a minute just before we got started, and I just have to point it out. You have the coolest blanket behind you. It's the White House blanket. But hold that thought, because I'm going to come back to it. I want to talk to you about your time at the White House. It's cool. I actually want to start, which I think is earlier in your career. You were at Bain & Company.
I was. That's where I started out when I was 21.
Uh-huh. And so you were in private equity. You were doing maybe on the turnaround side of things, and then also on their nonprofit arm. Can you talk about what you were doing there and some of the lessons learned, specifically maybe even about leadership?
Yeah, I think, I grew up in a public service household. My dad was a Navy pilot. My mom was an eighth grade English teacher. I always knew I wanted to do public service. And so for me, going out of college and into Bain was really about learning a set of tools. So learning not to be intimidated by economic modeling or getting into new fields or addressing complex issues and strategies. And then what happened, which I was so grateful for, is that some of the leaders at Bain started what was then called the Bridge Group and is now called Bridgespan. And it was basically a group of people who moved across the street. It used to be over the Hard Rock Cafe. I think I was employee number 10. But it was people who were bringing that same kind of rigor, that same work 90 plus hours a week. But instead of working on turning around companies, you were working on some really tough philanthropic nonprofit challenges. One of my first clients was a group of nuns in the South Bronx, in the poorest congressional district at the time in the country, who were running a community development corporation. And we were able to show up with $5 million, which was greatly increasing their budget, but trying to figure out how to spend it. And gosh, if I wanted to get things right, and I did for my corporate clients, boy, did I want to get it right for the South Bronx, right? So like to that ability to bring again, that rigor, that focus on data, but on some of the hardest problems that we face in communities, and work with such dedicated people was really a gift and a great way to start my career.
What an experience. Wow. And then shortly after, you moved over to the White House. Is that correct?
Oh, actually, the White House came, gosh, probably 15 years later. In the intervening time, I actually worked in Scottish politics, the totally obvious path.
Yeah. Okay. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's because I'm a military kid. I always say I respond well to direct instruction. So every job I've ever had has been someone saying, you should do this. And I'm really driven by passionate people and the opportunity to contribute and learn. And again, that's been mostly in the public sector, in public service. And so I went to Scotland for graduate school. It was actually in between Bain and Bridgespan. And then while I was there, because I worked until the day I got off the plane, so I was landing in a country where I didn't know anyone, and graduate school in Scotland was about 5 or 6 hours a week. So I got a full-time job on the side. Scottish Parliament had just reopened. It was closed for 300 years. Um, they're all Democrats over there, even the conservatives. So like it was all super interesting to me. And yeah, I just had an opportunity to work there, and then worked off and on. I'd periodically move back to the United States, but worked off and on in the Scottish Parliament and the British Parliament in London, and then as a special advisor to the First Minister of Scotland on economic policy for 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah,
And so
so
you were over there the whole time.
well, I would be there for a stretch for a couple of years and then come back, and it was a peripatetic path.
Okay.
But you know, again, to me, I believe so much in people and people who can move things. And you know, I often thought the political leaders I was working with, if they had been in Virginia or Boston, it would have been easier for me. But also, like, you find people who can move things. Like while I was there, Scotland passed world-leading climate change legislation, did all sorts of things. And because they have a party-based system, if you could convince the boss, the leader of the country, then it could happen, right? So it's
Hmm.
an amazing time to be able to get things done, and people working on things that I thought really mattered. And so, yeah, I still feel very connected to all of that. But eventually, as you probably picked up from my accent, I am not Scottish. So eventually came home for good. Worked at a think tank, the Center for American Progress on economic policy. And then when I had the opportunity to serve in the White House, that was actually in 2015, I went in.
Hmm.
I was there
Hmm.
for the last almost 2 years.
Talk about that experience.
Oh, it was amazing. Again, just the opportunity to serve. I was brought in by a total legend, Tom Khalil. He did all 8 years in the Clinton White House, all 8 years in the Obama White House, and he's just an amazing mind in how he gets things done. And just by way of example, he built a team of brilliant people working on all sorts of things. You know, I shared first office I shared was with amazing woman Jen Gustetic from NASA, who was on loan, who was working on grand challenges. And then I worked with Doug Rand, who was working on entrepreneurship and clean energy plans. And so Tom built this team of amazing people. Ruth Farmer, who you had on recently, was working on computer science for all. Robbie Barbero doing bioengineering. Kumar Garg doing basically just making everything more effective. He started on education initiatives, but you know, these amazing people. And Tom built this team where everyone was so connected and helping people move forward. But one of the things that I think speaks a lot to his leadership style is when he brought me in, he left half of my job open and said, go find a problem we can fix. Which, what an amazing boss, right?
Hmm.
And the orientation that he would give everyone, and President Obama would talk about this too, is, you know, when you're in the White House, you have no budget, you have no staff. What you have is a desk and a phone. So you have a period of time where people will take your call, where you're there to hustle, where you're there to make something happen for people around the country. And so after talking to experts, ended up picking ending the waiting list for organ transplant. So that's most of what I worked on there and what I've continued to work on since. But it was just an amazing time limited opportunity to serve and to try and do so creatively and with in one sense incredibly limited resources, and then in other senses it's boundless, right?
Hmm.
Where does your imagination end? So it was I feel very fortunate to have had that opportunity.
I read that as part of your job, you focused on supporting inclusive entrepreneurship around the country. What exactly is that?
Yeah, well, if you look at venture capital funded entrepreneurship, so a lot of the high growth entrepreneurship, you know, it is when I was there, if it's changed, probably not too much. The state of California had more venture capital funding than all other states combined, right? If you looked at venture capital backed businesses that were run by women, 3% of venture capital backed businesses, African Americans 1%. Um, so, and you know, some other demographics we weren't even tracking, right? And so if you believe, as I do, that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not, then we have a problem. Not just as an issue of equity and fairness, but as a country, we're missing the boat if we are not making sure that we're tapping into those strengths that exist, not just in different types of people, but different places, right? Like all over, like what's happening in entrepreneurship in Wyoming, what's happening with amazing, I mean, you look at Birmingham, Alabama, it has now the highest growing African-American female entrepreneurship in the country, right? And so making sure that we're tapping into that because it's the smart thing to do. And so that's a lot of what we did. We actually hosted a demo day. In Silicon Valley, it's very common that you come and you demo your products or your business. And so we hosted one at the White House, which was amazing to bring people from all over the country and just highlight that that there's talent everywhere, and it's in all of our interest to make sure that that we're seeding that talent. So yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Is that a typical thing that the White House does no matter what the administration? And then did you feel like the needle was moving?
Good questions. Every administration has its own flavor and its own way of doing things, to be sure. So I think that we were very focused on, again, bringing people in and lifting people and ideas up. I mentioned my colleague Kumar Garg before. He and others started the White House Science Fair, right? Which was always the most fun day. I mean, these kids, they were brilliant. I have to tell you, as an aside, there was, back to I work on organ issues. And so there was one amazing young woman, 17 years old, out of Kentucky, who was looking at kidney disease and running all these experiments. And I went to go say hello to her. And she's a very different 17 than I was 17, because I thought like, oh, I'm gonna blow her mind. I'm gonna bring over the head of the National Institutes of Health to meet her. And I said, let me go get Francis Collins. And she said, oh, he funds my lab. It's like, oh my gosh, these kids, right? They're just mind blowing. There was another kid there, 8 years old, Jacob, who said he wanted to 3D print organs, and he talked to the president, and he again like had no barriers. And he said, why don't you have children be science advisors to you too? And the president said, that's a great idea. So they actually started a children's like science advisory committee. So I think, to your question about different White Houses, I think different, we had people or policy, people approach things differently, and how to use those opportunities to really bring people in and lift things up. And it's exciting, right? Like there's such great things happening everywhere. We did a White House summit on organ donation. And so typically what we would do is we would put out casting calls and say, like, what are your ideas? What are your ideas to solve the organ waiting list? And they would come from inside government and outside government. So the Department of Defense had like made huge commitments on organ regeneration. We had amazing commitments from Silicon Valley on the tech side, from surgeons, from patient groups, so like, and it's an opportunity like for people who have ideas to lift them up for things they might have done in 18 months. Maybe they do them in 6 weeks, right? Like it just is a great accelerant of talent and energy. And so that's how I was in the Office of Science Technology Policy. So that's how we approached a lot of this. Again, there's amazing stuff happening everywhere. How do we amplify it and accelerate it?
And so the other part of your role was to sort of tackle a grand challenge, and others, I think, in the administration had that same kind of idea. One question I have before we get into the actual grand challenge is, how does somebody like you get funded to be in the White House?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, I was actually a fellow of AAAS, the Academy of Sciences. So again, since I was in the science and tech team, there were people who came from there. There were a lot of people. I mentioned my colleague who was over from NASA, who are on loan from other agencies doing brilliant things. And I think, again, everyone approaches this with a real sense of urgency and purpose, that you're there for a limited time. Even some of my colleagues who were there for years, 6 or 8 years, like it's still such a particular time when you can do a different set of things. So I think everyone approached it with a real duty of care. But people came from private sector, from the academy, from other agencies. Yeah, so it was a great team to be a part of.
Mm. And so as you started to think about what's my grand challenge going to be, what was the process like? And then how did you land on what you landed on?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I have seen kidney failure up close. Uh, if you have loved someone who's been on dialysis, it's a really, really grueling treatment. And I think about this a lot since I come from science and tech policy. If dialysis didn't exist and it were invented today, we'd be saying, "Oh my gosh, Rob, can you believe you can live without kidneys? That's amazing. Science is amazing." But that technology has existed for, gosh, since the 1940s and hasn't gotten all that much better, right? And so, had the opportunity to realize that we could do a lot better by patients. And then, when you start realizing the amazing things that are happening in labs, right? Like eventually I hope we're in a place where we can 3D print or bioengineer, like for each individual patient. They need a meniscus, they need a liver, like it all comes out of a lab. Like that's the future we started on. And then what we came to realize is we could help a lot more people now. The really, really shocking thing that we came across, and this is out of peer-reviewed research, University of Pennsylvania, is that tens of thousands of organs go unrecovered every year. And if you think about that, that's nuts, right? I mean, this is something we agree on as a country. Americans have huge goodwill towards organ donation. 90% of Americans support it, which is really phenomenal, right? Like it's an amazingly generous thing that we've all agreed on. And then you realize, like, what do you mean? It might not matter that that's my wish, or that I signed up at the DMV, or whatever, that the system could still fail. And so that became a lot of the focus at the end of what I worked on, and what I've worked on since is, that 28,000 organs, that's 17,000 kidneys, 17,000 people a year that don't have to be on dialysis. It's 8,000 livers, 1,500 hearts, 1,500 lungs. I mean, on the research that's out there, we don't have to have a waiting list for hearts, livers, and lungs within 3 years if we fix the system. And you think about what that could mean uh, for families, for the country.
Mhm.
I feel a great sense of urgency about it, and also excitement to see what we can do. So yeah, so that's what we worked on. So how did I alight on that? Most things, talk to people smarter than me, and see what they say. And there was an organization at the time that had an innovator in residence position at the Department of Health and Human Services called Organize. And they were working with the University of Pennsylvania, funnily enough, in a confluence of things with Bridgespan as well, decades after I left, nothing to do with me, and really put a fine point on how we could help patients and follow the data.
Mhm.
So yeah, so that's what we did.
Yeah. So, and prior to speaking with you, I'm signed up as an organ donor,
Yeah,
and as I said, I guess 90% of us are,
yeah.
or supportive of it, I suppose.
Mhm.
And I never thought about it. I never thought about the idea that if I were gone, and I always I had this idealized thing in my head that great, they'll get the organs needed and
Yeah,
it'll get off and go to good use. And, I'm actually quite excited about that.
yeah,
And it was interesting to hear that a lot of these organs don't get collected.
yeah. No, it's true. So you're right. So the vast majority of us support it. The majority of Americans are registered. There's still a gap between those who support it and those who have registered. So everyone listening or watching, organdonor.gov, tell your family by all means. But there's still a really critical step, right? Which is whether you're registered or not. Either way, what's supposed to happen is there are government granted contractors who are supposed to coordinate that organ donation. They're called organ procurement organizations. They each have their own area. Some have a whole state, some have a part of it, or cross state boundaries. But the work they do is so important because they're the ones who will coordinate and send someone to the hospital to talk to your family. to make sure that happens, to make sure that your organs, you have up to 8 organs, can get placed around the country to people who need them most. And so that work is incredibly important. It also is done incredibly variably on this data, including on data the government has put out. There is almost a 500% difference between the top performers and the worst performers in ways that can't be explained, right? And this is where, again, people matter, leadership matters, right? Like the organ procurement organizations, the OPOs that are getting it done, that are serving their communities, fantastic. Those that aren't, and this is a really key point, none, not one, has ever lost their government contract in the almost 40 years the system has been in place. And so hopefully that's changing. There's now a bipartisan push to, again, follow the data and make sure that every community around the country is served by a high-performing organ procurement organization. And I'm perfectly aware most people have never heard of these, but like I hadn't before either. But it's so critical because it doesn't stop with your wish or your desire to help people. You still need people who are coordinating that and making that happen. There was just a really powerful piece that was written by 2 amazing leaders of organ procurement organizations, one out of Missouri, Diane Brockmeyer, one out of Florida, Ginny McBride, who said, like, this is a life and death issue. And what matters is, are people serving patients? And we should absolutely be held accountable to the data, and everyone deserves the very best. And so it might sound like a really obvious point, like, is the government going to hold its own contractors accountable? But that's where the policy issue is right now. I'm very hopeful. There are very few bipartisan health issues that are moving right now. This is one. And so, it has the support of the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the current administration. It has the support of Obama alumni, the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, so there's a real opportunity to get something done for patients. I really hope we can get it there. Policy is a long, long slog. And even if something seems totally obvious, like, wait, you can save lives. Oh, you can save money at the same time. Oh, you can do it all by following data and just instituting basic accountability. You're probably thinking, like, done, right? That's what's happening next. That sounds easy. But there are some really powerfully entrenched interests whenever you're talking about government contracting. And so just trying to make sure that patients are the focus of everything we do. And that's why I really want to salute those 2 leaders who have stood up and said, it's not about who holds the contract. It's about how many lives we're saving.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to see more of that.
Of these organ procurement contractors, did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Are they for profit?
They are not for profit. But they have really interesting financing structures, pretty unique in American healthcare. They basically get to pass on whatever they spend. So salaries can go north of $800,000, $1 million. These, by the way, are not surgeons. These are people who run, again, a government-granted nonprofit contract. So, I think that the finances in this space are curious, I will say. But my main thing is, are people getting things done for their patients? And when you're talking about a 500% variability, clearly the answer is some are and some aren't. If you are talking about Kentucky or South Carolina on the data that were published from a few years ago, 1 out of 4 organ donors are recovered. That's mind-blowing, right? I'm from the state of Virginia. 1 out of 3 organ donors, meaning 2 out of 3 are not. And so, again, depending on the moment you catch me, Rob, I either find that absolutely infuriating and heartbreaking, and 33 Americans are dying every day. What are we doing, right? And then the flip side of that is this sense of urgency, and we can do so much better. As committed as I am to where we started on this journey at the White House, which is, again, how do we eventually 3D print or bioengineer whatever you need? Terrific. But if you're telling me we can do something to help the 110,000 Americans waiting today, like that's my focus on a Tuesday morning, right? Mm-hmm. And again, I view my role both when I was in government and now outside it, working with philanthropies, as like an interlocutor. How do I find people who are smarter than me? How do I find people who've figured out how we follow the data. How do we find people? There are other OPO leaders who have turned around failing OPOs really quickly. You can look at San Francisco. They got a new leader in 2019. Organ recovery in San Francisco went up by 29% in 1 year. Dayton, Ohio got a new leader this year. Organ recovery in Dayton is, again, in the midst of pandemic, increased by over 30% in a year. And so on the one hand, it's both really exciting. And I know you talk a lot to leaders and about how leaders lead. They're going to hospitals that had been ignored. There's a lot of really troubling issues of inequality and who's approached and how there's approached. I mean, research shows that Black families are both less likely to be approached for organ donation and talked to less when they are. What are we doing? Right? And so when you talk to leaders who said, like, that's not who we're going to be, like that's not the way to succeed, that's not the way to serve, that's not the way to tackle the organ waiting list, and then they're like turning things around really quickly, which again, like I said, depending on the moment you catch me, it's infuriating. How can you have that kind of variability and the government's still not holding you account? And then also really excited, like, oh my gosh, let's talk to those leaders, let's get more of those people, right? That's what we need. That's what patients deserve. And I think, so many issues in healthcare, I think about this way, like the problem is really easy to understand and the solution is hard. Problem, cancer is wrecking. Solution, research, clinical trials, patient care, right? Problem, how do we get everyone equal access to healthcare when it's so expensive? Solutions, hugely complicated, unfortunately very political, right? This, I honestly think in organ donation is the opposite. The problem is hard to understand. Like you said, wait, I'm an organ donor, right? Like I support this. I signed up. What do you mean that might not be enough, right? That's hard to understand. The solution, the government has data. We should follow that data. If people are doing a good job, they get to keep doing it. If they're not doing a good job, we should have someone else do it. Like that's actually as straightforward as I think you get. But I like you said, I think it's like the record scratch on what the problem is. But the good news is it's fixable.
If we could get it under control and in a better spot, just talking dollars and cents, is there any opportunity to save taxpayer dollars?
Huge, huge. Fun fact, the only disease or illness that automatically qualifies you for Medicare is kidney failure. Most patients waiting for organs are waiting for kidneys. So back to what I was talking about, dialysis, which is grueling. And you think about the risks of COVID-19, right? There's 500,000 Americans who cannot socially isolate because they're crowded into dialysis centers 3 times a week. How terrifying is that, right? So dialysis, John Oliver did a show a few years ago and he said, it's like your kidneys and only your kidneys are Canadian, right? So let me put into perspective how much Americans spend on kidney disease every year, just out of Medicare, before you get to the VA, before you get to Medicaid, $114 billion a year on kidneys.
Can you say again, billion?
Yeah, $114 billion a year. I'll put it in scale. 6 NASAs. We spend 6 NASAs a year on kidneys. So of that's all kidney disease. Of that kidney failure, so you're talking about Americans on dialysis, that's $36 billion a year. That's 1% of the federal budget. So, it's just truly mind-blowing how much we're spending on this. And if we get those patients transplants, not only can they live longer at a better quality of life, we're saving a ton of money. And again, that's a really rare Yahtzee in public policy, right? Where I've never seen an issue where the patient's interests are so directly aligned with the taxpayer interests. There are economists have estimated that for every patient who gets a kidney transplant, we save $250,000. So again, what I care about, what I'm sure most people care about most is those people's lives. But what an opportunity, right? If we get that right. We're talking about the ability to save tens of billions of dollars a year while helping Americans at the same time. This is huge and it's exciting. So we have every reason to get it right.
What if someone said, I'd be willing to do a transplant, I'd like to get on the list for a kidney.
Uh-huh.
What are the risks of having the transplant versus staying on dialysis?
Yeah. Yeah. So if there is a risk in getting a transplant that your body could reject it. The one of the amazing things that happened about 40 years ago is the advent of modern immunosuppression, right? So you can take organs from a variety of people who you're not related to, um, but you have to immunosuppress your body so it is willing to accept that organ. So sometimes um, sometimes your body could reject the organ. That so that's possible. That's rare, graft failure. The reality is, again, dialysis is grueling if you've ever talked to anyone on it, and it will keep you alive, but at a real cost. It runs down your other organs, and so for most patients, not all. So of course, everyone should talk to their physicians, but for most patients, not all. But uh, a transplant is definitely the right answer. But again, it's a really, really long line. And one of the things about the waiting list is very often people have to get so sick before they get to the top of the list. And so that's why we have to fix it, not just so we're not running into that situation where 33 Americans are dying every day, but also, they're even better able to take the transplant. Again, transplantation is a life-saving thing. Like the vast majority of patients, any organ, are better off getting a transplant than not, unquestionably. But even better if they can get it sooner, usually, right? Because then they're healthier.
Of course.
And I do want to say too, like, I just want to mention the tremendous generosity of living donors. People can donate a kidney, a part of their liver, and many Americans do, and to loved ones, even to strangers, which is an amazing gift. And one of the things the current administration did is expand support for living donors, so that things like their cost of travel and things like that are covered. I mean, my goodness, of course we should. Like, what an amazing gift. And then you go back to most of those are kidneys, and what I was saying about the finances, like, we have every reason to take away any financial barriers we can from any American who's considering being a living donor. That's amazing. So I want to, again, just talk about how phenomenal that gift is, and then also say, the biggest single opportunity we have is fixing the deceased donation system. Americans support it. We can follow the data. We can save lives and money. And so we're not there yet, but we're closer than we've ever been. And again, like, credit where it's due. Like, the current administration is working with politicians from across the aisle. They're working on following the data, bringing in basic accountability, which is, that should be table stakes, right? For anyone in public service.
Yeah.
But it hasn't been there. So
I back to the dollars and cents for a second, and I may have my facts wrong, so correct me. I read that you just mentioned a little bit ago, 1% of our budget goes into paying for dialysis.
Yeah.
Correct. Did I read correctly that 2% goes to education?
Oh gosh, you're gonna test me on the federal budget.
Well, I read that and I thought that's unbelievable. So like 1%, somebody might say, well, that's, it's 1% of our total budget. It's really not that much. But just for perspective, if that's correct, 2%, and we're talking about education.
Yeah.
I mean, our educational system, I mean, it's 2%.
Right. Yeah. Well, again, like I mentioned, the NASA comparison, six NASAs is what we spend on kidneys. That's all kidney disease. If you're looking at kidney failure, just dialysis, right? Just one modality of treatment. That's the same as NASA plus the whole Centers for Disease Control.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of Americans might not have heard of dialysis, or they might not know much about it.
Well, sure, if you drive by any street corner, in most cities, you'll see a dialysis center. It's a huge business.
Yeah, it is. And again, the amazing thing is just thinking, like, wow, that there's something better for most patients
Right.
and save money if we do that.
Yeah.
But that's, yeah,
Yeah.
we've got to get it right.
And so the work that you're doing now with this, with the organ transplants, it's funded by through Schmidt Futures, where you're a Schmidt Future Fellow, correct?
Mhm.
Can you talk about the Schmidt Futures Fellows? What that is? What is that all about?
Yeah, so Schmidt Futures philanthropy started by Eric and Wendy Schmidt. They were amazing philanthropists who follow the data.
And
Uh,
who are they? Just for those that might not know.
so Eric Schmidt used to be the chairman and CEO of Google.
Oh,
So,
Google. Does anybody know what that is?
right. So and and the Schmidts have been, amazing philanthropists investing in science and technology and talent across a range of things. Um, Several of my colleagues work there now, former colleagues, doing really amazing things. And I think I also want to mention Laura and John Arnold, who are Giving Pledge philanthropists out of Texas, who have been long-term funders of this work. They were funding research. I mentioned the University of Pennsylvania and organized research. They were funding that when I was in the White House. So that's how I first met that philanthropy and their team there. And yeah, it's just, I think what's so interesting about these philanthropists is they just want to follow the data. Again, I talk about that record scratch. It's like, wait, we can save lives and money at the same time, and you're telling me it's data we already have? Like, the United States government already knows where and broadly how people die around the United States. Like, we can already do this. We can figure out where there are opportunities to do better. And so, yeah, it's just been an amazing opportunity, like I said, to just be an interlocutor to support research and researchers and really practical solutions, highlight like what's wrong. And then this is the key point, how you fix it. Once you've been inside government, you can have a long list of what's wrong. Unless you know very specifically what to do about it, you just leave a meeting depressed, right? Like, you need to know how you advance the ball. What's the regulation you change? What's the different policy you put in place? And so, yeah, so both Schmidt and the Arnolds have been, again, great supporters of following the data, which I'm grateful for.
That's fantastic. And, thank you for doing this and for bringing this sort of thing to the forefront, and being a leader in this way. We talk a bit about the interconnectedness of things in this world and of us, as humans. And wow, what a gift that you could give to somebody, is, your organ. If you're gone, or in some cases, if you're still here, you can still do that. And to think that you can keep somebody alive and they can have a thriving life because of that. Talk about being interconnected. It's amazing. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, thank you.
Means the world.
Yeah, and again, to everyone out there, like, if you are supportive of organ donation, tell people, register. Again, the government now has to do its job and make sure the system is honoring those wishes and working for all of us. But you're right. It's a amazing thing that people do for each other, and we need to make sure the system works.
Totally. And Jennifer, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today and bring this conversation of how we can lead with genuine care for each other to the forefront. And to all the loyal listeners, as always, I greatly appreciate you spending time with us today. And I wish you all much love and gratitude.
Thanks.